Hi, it's Jared O'D here, Director of Training for Dynamis, and today I want to talk to you about breakaway skills for staff. Now, over the years, in teaching our various different programs across the country in conflict management, personal safety, we worked a lot with lone workers, and we do a huge amount of work in terms of physical interventions and restraint reduction. We've been asked many, many times, and we deliver to many, many groups a program of physical disengagement from violence, which is often termed breakaway skills in the industry. Now, I think the way we do that is quite unique and individual. So, today, if you'll bear with me, I'm going to spend a few minutes just talking about the legal context behind why we do it the way we do it, and also some of the scientific journal articles and the research that's out there, which is the bedrock of how we do breakaway skills training. So, to start off with, the legal context at the moment, as you well know, is very, very tight in regards to use of force in care, healthcare, social care, or education settings in particular. And we could even extend that to the security sector, where there's new regulations for the last few years about um, the appropriate use of force and so on. So, individuals and companies have statutory responsibilities. They'll also be working within regulatory frameworks and government department guidance. But one of the key things that we need to be aware of as we look at this whole area is the increasing use of scientific rigor to improve decision making for use of force. So a great example of this is that the Force Science Institute, which is an American body dedicated to the use of things like time and motion studies and psychological information and research and experiments that they've carried out to improve decision making, when they, the Force Science Institute, were asked to give evidence on behalf of officers uh, from the Metropolitan Police who were involved in this case called the Stanley case, the Stanley shooting. Um, Ultimately, it was the scientific evidence that this body brought to that case that allowed it to be brought to a successful close after, I think, as much as 10 years and three separate prosecutions that were brought against the officers. It took this highly technical information about the use of force to finally bring it to a close. And I think this is something that, as an expert witness myself, and in looking around and talking with my colleagues, we have to be very, very aware that increasingly this scientifically rigorous approach to the use of force is becoming something that's a trend, something we need to be aware of. And so when we're asked how we develop our training programs, or when our training programs are tested, or when we are asked by one of our learners, why do we have to do it like so or like this, then increasingly, I believe we need to have an evidence base for our answers and not just be able to rely on, well, answers like that's what it says in the manual, or that's what my instructor told me, or even, answers like that's the way it's always been done. I think increasingly we have to show that there's an evidence base for what we're doing. So let's look at some of the journal articles that are out there. So research that people have carried out on Breakaway and so on. There's a handful of really key articles that I would recommend you go and look at, but I'm going to just summarize a few of them here. Um, Basically, what you can see is that there's a variable picture when we look at how staff are being able to use breakaway techniques in practice. Simply speaking, the techniques that people are being taught aren't really making an appearance in the incidents and the scenarios and the confrontations they're having. In one study, only 3 out of 19 staff that were interviewed used a recognized breakaway technique. In another study, almost half the nurses said that they didn't have time to respond to the attack they were involved in. Um, Another study at quite a high profile facility service, 40% of the staff failed to escape from a stranglehold within 10 seconds using the correct technique, so-called correct technique. However, about 80% of people in one study did manage to get away from the physical assault, even though they didn't use anything that looked like a technique that they had been taught, which is going to bring me to a really key realization that we need to have here in just a few minutes. But before we go on to that, we see programs quite often that have a large number of techniques. Now, the study that was carried out here looking at practice time found that in a breakaway training program that was carried out over a full training day, there were some 15 techniques taught, and through breaks and explanations and demonstration time and then practice time, it was found that the learners on that course only really got about just over 6 minutes of practice time per technique. Now, that has a huge impact on the assimilation of those techniques into that person's individual repertoire of coping strategies in the first place. And I think it'll also have a really key impact on their retention of those methods over time. You can imagine with 6 minutes of practice just how well that person will perform that skill in 3 months or 6 months or 9 or 12 months after the training day. There has to be some real questions about that. So there are some really interesting problems here. What some researchers are looking at is whether or not we can actually learn from the academics, the professionals, the practitioners whose job it is to look at the acquisition of motor skills. And though those are generally speaking the sports science, the sports psychology, um, research bodies and academics at the universities and the practitioners who are involved in coaching physical skills and high performance. And one researcher that I met, Benson, back in 2010, he was particularly strong on this point. He said that we really should be talking to the sports scientists to bring their academic rigor and their scientific approach to the development of these motor skills that we're looking to develop when we teach people breakaway skills. Interestingly, another research report, a journal article that's out there, talks about how breakaway methods that center on natural instinct, the things, the instinctive protective motions that people will naturally do before they've had any training, as opposed to these highly technical maneuvers that are generally taught on the training courses. The natural instinctive responses are more likely to be recalled more successfully. And so the question becomes, should this be the basis of our training? Looking at the natural instinctive responses of a human being and then adapting our training methods to refine and improve those natural instinctive responses rather than trying to reprogram our trainees in a very short space of time to move in ways that they possibly never have moved before. That's the really difficult and thorny question around breakaway skills. So that's part one of my talk. I'm going to go ahead and create a couple of other these talks about breakaway skills. As I say, it's a subject that's dear to our hearts here at Dynamis. And I will be publishing these over a period of weeks, so I hope to interest you in listening to some more. Thanks for your time today, and I'll see you on the next one.